Hey everyone, welcome back. So today we're going to talk about interpreting transition matrices. So this is looking at the matrix within a context and trying to give us an understanding as to what the elements mean and how they relate within this context and how we can use them to find some answers. So grab a pen, grab a book, and we'll get started. Okay, so I've come prepared this week. So what I've done is I've already drawn up our transition matrix here, and to the right hand side we've got the network or the diagram which it originated from. Now this matrix is in terms of the context of fiction and non-fiction books. So it's a weekly pattern of fiction and non-fiction books borrowed at a local library week to week. So you can see at the top of the matrix I've written this week. So the top ones, that's how that's the direction that we go on. So we go from this week and then we look to the corresponding week on the side, which says next week. Okay, so let's zone in and quickly have a look at some of the elements in this matrix. Okay, so for someone to borrow a fiction book this week and to borrow a fiction book next week, we're looking at this element here, which is 0.8, meaning 80%. So 80% of people who borrow fiction this week will borrow fiction next week. Now, the element just underneath, 0.2, that relates to 20%. So that's saying people that borrow a fiction book this week, 20% are going to borrow a non-fiction book next week. And it's the same thing in the next column over. What we're just looking at here is non-fiction. So people that borrow non-fiction this week, 90% are going to borrow non-fiction next week. And then 0.1, that relates to 10% here. And that says non-fiction this week, 10% are borrowing fiction next week. So they're doing the opposite. So that's what all these elements in this transition matrix here relate to. And when we look at our diagram next to it, we can see that it makes sense. We've got the percentages here all labeled there, which signify the percentage of people moving around, transitioning their change in books per week. Okay, so now what we're doing is moving on to some questions. So let's go to question A. So if 50 people borrow a fiction book in the first week, how many will borrow a fiction book in the second week? So this is the first part, A question 1. So let's have a look. So what we're doing is we're going from fiction to fiction. So let's first identify the element that we need. So here's our transition matrix up here. So we want to go from fiction to fiction. So this is the element we need for that question. And remember 0.8, that relates to 80%. So if 80% of people borrow a fiction book in week 1, then they're going to borrow one in week 2, then we need to go 80 times 50. So that's the number of people borrowing the book. And that's going to give us an answer. So 80 times 50, well, that's also 80 over 100 times 50. And that simplifies to 40. So 40 people will be borrowing fiction in the first week and then borrowing fiction in the second week. Okay, so now let's look at question A2. So again, same thing. If 50 people borrow a fiction book in the first week, how many will borrow now a non-fiction book in the second week? So what we're doing is we're going from fiction here to non-fiction. So let's go back up to our transition matrix and see what element we need. So we're going fiction to non-fiction. So the element that we need is 0.2. So let's write that down here so we remember. Now 0.2 is the same as 20%. So same thing as before, it's still 50 people, but now it's 20% of 50 people, which when we put it in maths terms, it's 20 over 100 times 50, which gives us 10 people. So 10 people go from fiction to non-fiction in the second week. Okay, so moving on now we're going to look at some different questions. So this is question B, question 1. And question B asks, if 40 people borrow non-fiction in the first week, how many people will borrow, firstly, fiction in the next week? So this time we're going from non-fiction to fiction. So back to the matrix, let's look at the element that we made. So we're going from non-fiction to fiction. So we need 0.1. Now that is the same as 10%, that's right. So it's 10% of 40 people, which is 10 over 100 times 40. And when we simplify that, it becomes 4 people. Okay, so let's have a look at the second question now. So question B, number 2. So same thing, so if 40 people borrow non-fiction the first week, how many will borrow non-fiction in the next week? So this time it's non-fiction to non-fiction. So what element do we need? Well, non-fiction, 0.9. So 0.9, that's the same as 90%. So it's going to be 90% of, remember, 40 people. So 90% of 40 people, oops, lost my page there for a second, which is the same as 90 over 100 times 40, which equals 36 people. Okay, and final question now, question C. So if 30 people borrow fiction and 20 people borrow non-fiction, how many people will borrow the same book in a week's time? So this is kind of a two-part question. Let's break it down because it looks a little bit more complicated. So the first one is saying 30 people borrow fiction and 20 people borrow non-fiction. And what the question is asking is how many people will borrow the same book in a week's time? So that's what we're saying is how many people will go from fiction to fiction and how many will go from non-fiction to non-fiction. Alright, so let's have a look at the elements that we need. So I'm going to focus on this one first, so fiction to fiction. So fiction to fiction is 0.8. So it's going to be 0.8, which is the same as 80%. You got it right. Okay, so that's 80 over 100 times 30, which comes to 24 people. Sorry, 24 people are going to borrow fiction the next week as well. Alright, so now let's look at the second one, non-fiction. So we're going from non-fiction to non-fiction, so N to N. Now for that we need 0.9. So 0.9 is the same as 90%, which in maths terms is 90 over 100 times, now this time it's 20 people, because 20 people borrow non-fiction. So it's 90 over 100 times 20, which equals 18 people. So 18 people borrow non-fiction the first week and then the second week. So they follow through, they keep the same choice. Now, we're not done there, because the question is asking how many people will borrow the same book in a week's time. So we know how many people will borrow the same fiction book. We know how many people will borrow the same non-fiction book. So what we need to do is we finally just need to add them both up. So it's 24 plus 18, which gives us 42. So the answer is 42 people will borrow the same book. Thanks so much for watching today, guys. Hopefully this video helped you in identifying and understanding how we can use and interpret transition matrices in contexts. Now, our next video in this series will be generating the state matrix and using the state matrix in the relation to the transition matrices. So stay tuned for that video. Otherwise, give it a like if it was useful and subscribe for more.